Today on the Relationship Revival Show, I'm joined by Lisa Skinner. Lisa Skinner is a behavioral specialist in the field of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. In her 30-plus year career as a community counselor, private advisor, regional director of senior care facilities, and certified dementia care trainer through the Alzheimer's Association, she's helped thousands of families and caregivers understand the daunting challenges of living with brain disease. Her number one best-selling book, Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost, was written at their urging. Her latest book, Truth, Lies, and Alzheimer's: Its Secret Faces, continues Skinner's quest of working with dementia-related illnesses by teaching families and caregivers how they can have a better quality relationship with their loved ones through education and workshops on counterintuitive solutions, effective communication techniques, care strategies, and helpful tools to help people effectively manage the symptoms of brain disease. You're listening to the Relationship Revival Podcast with John DeBach, also known as Mr. Spirituality. That's me. I'm your host, giving you insights and guidance from over 10 years in the field of this amazing journey we call romance. On this show, I go over everything you need to know about how to get into a relationship, how to get the most out of a relationship, and sometimes even how to gracefully end a relationship without pulling your hair out and going crazy. And occasionally, I'm even joined by new and old friends who are also relationship experts to bring you guidance and wisdom with new perspectives. Thanks for stopping by. Lisa Skinner, thank you so much for being on the program. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, John. Thank you so much for asking me to be here. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I've seen in my own practice working with couples is when parents start to have issues, health issues, it could take a real toll on a couple's relationship. And one of the things that comes up is dementia, Alzheimer's, different things, and how to deal with it, and how to support your partner through the grief, how to help with taking care of mom and dad, whether you decide to be the caretaker or put them in a facility. And, unfortunately, in this field, people just don't think about it till it hits them in the face directly, is what I found.
You are absolutely spot on with that. I've been doing this professionally for about 30 years now, and that's been my exact experience with family members, and kind of along the lines of what you just said. I have seen this disease just rip families apart for a variety of different reasons. And I personally have seen, and this is my observation, that one of the key reasons why that happens is due to people's lack of understanding about this disease, and as you said, lack of preparation.
So, with that in mind, if what's your big message? I know you've written 2 books and there's a lot to talk about, but what is the one thing that you wish everybody did to kind of get grounded, get educated about this?
Well, that certainly is my emphasis based on my decades of experience counseling and working with families. And my advice to everybody is, if this hits your family, and the chances of it doing so are pretty high.
Yeah.
I'll tell you the most recent statistics about that in a second. But to answer your question, John, it's really learn as much about the disease as you possibly can, because this is a long course that everybody's going to be on. And it impacts every single person. It's not only the person who suffers from Alzheimer's or one of the other 100 or so brain diseases that causes dementia, but it impacts the families in many, many ways. And the caregivers, friends, everybody. And I think that primarily it's because people really don't have an unclouded understanding about the disease. They believe in the myths that have been circulating around for decades that don't seem to really change a whole lot. And most people relate this illness, Alzheimer's disease specifically, because it's the most common one, with it really exclusively being a disease that causes memory loss and confusion. And it is so much more complicated than that. But because of the lack of understanding about what this disease is actually doing to the brain of the person suffering from it, people still have a difficult time connecting the dots and relating all of the behaviors and the signs and the symptoms that they see with their loved one on a daily basis as it being part of the disease, instead of, okay, well, the disease is causing the memory loss and the confusion, and then they're acting like this. So I think in addition to them having Alzheimer's disease, they're also going crazy. But it's all part of the same disease. And I think that that's a really important principle to understand. So learn what you can, as much as you can, about the disease. And I will tell you that based on the many testimonials that I have received from family members and caregivers, you don't get a lot of information from the physicians. They basically give you the diagnosis and then
a pamphlet or something, and you're on your own.
Yeah, if you're lucky to get a pamphlet. And the World Alzheimer's Report just came out in 2022. So actually it was in the last 6 months. It's very recent. And the number one crisis that they discovered and brought to everybody's attention was the lack of post-diagnosis care and information that is given to families after they're told that their loved one has like an Alzheimer's disease, and they're just kind of left feeling stranded, like, okay, well, what do we do next? What's our expectation? What are we supposed to do? What does our future look like? And so that's kind of their number one focus right now, is to change that. But that's been my experience for 30 years.
Wow.
And then to have that come out in this world report it wasn't surprising to me, but it was kind of mind-boggling that it's that way today.
Yeah, that makes sense. You talked about the myths of Alzheimer's. I'd love to dispel some and kind of go over some of the common myths that people have, if that's okay with you.
Oh, sure. So there's quite a few of them, but some of the more common ones is that this disease only strikes older people. And that is not entirely true.
Right. You have early onset. That's
exactly right. Early onset, but that's a rarer form of Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
It's actually considered Alzheimer's disease. The difference is it's the genetic form, and it tends to show up at a much earlier age than our traditional Alzheimer's disease, which typically doesn't show up until after the age of 65. And then the other part of that myth is that if somebody in your family, so personally, I've had 8 family members
8
suffer from dementia. Yeah.
Wow.
And 5 of those are blood relatives.
Wow.
3 were through marriage, but 5 blood relatives. So, I mean, if I didn't know better, I would think, oh my gosh, it's only a matter of time and I'm next.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily true. I have done so much research on this. And basically the way it works is there are a lot of risk factors that go into determining whether or not somebody will develop Alzheimer's disease. And then there's exceptions to that rule. So there are several what we call non-modifiable risk factors. And the number one non-modifiable risk factor is our age.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So, and we can't change that. We can't do anything
Not
about
yet,
our
right?
Yeah. So with the exception of early onset Alzheimer's, yes, it's true that typically it does not show up in people till after the age of 65. Another non-modifiable risk factor is gender. So females tend to be more prone to getting Alzheimer's disease than men.
Okay.
The jury's still out as to why exactly that is. Some of the theories say it's because we live longer, and there are other theories that think it may be due to the difference in the hormones that women carry versus men. But the fact remains that there are more women who develop Alzheimer's disease.
Do you happen to know the statistics on the percentage breakdown or the ratio between men and women?
I want to say maybe a third more women have it than men.
Pretty significant.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And, all the years that I've spent in the elder care industry, that is
holds true. Yeah.
Yeah, there are way, way, way more women in the memory care units than there are men. But it strikes everybody. So we can't change our gender. We can't change our ethnicity. So there are certain ethnicities that are at a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease than others. A statistic just came out in the last year that Latinos are at a 50% higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease than their Caucasian counterparts.
Wow.
African Americans are at a higher risk, Pacific Islanders, Asians. So we can't change our ethnicity. So you see where I'm going with this? You have to first look at the things you can't change, because if that applies to you, you're 65 or older, you're a female, you're a Latino, and there's a couple other non-modifiable risk factors. You have those going against you right out of the gate.
Sure.
So that's going to increase your risk of developing Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
Then the second part of that are your modifiable risk factors, the ones that you can change or can treat or can do something about. The number one modifiable risk factor that is attributed to increasing a person's risk of developing Alzheimer's disease is cardiovascular disease. That's the number one, over and above the non-modifiable.
So like post heart attack, we see a huge, increase in the likelihood of Alzheimer's. Is that what you're kind of saying?
Any heart condition. High blood pressure. Yeah. So, but the good news is if you do have some cardiovascular condition, it can be treated through medications and exercise and proper diet and things like that. So if you are being treated for a cardiovascular disease, then it will, I don't know, 100% negate that from kind of piling into your pot of risk factors, but it will help. So some of the other modifiable risk factors are diabetes is huge. A lot of people who develop Alzheimer's disease actually suffer from diabetes, but it's not as high a risk factor as cardiovascular disease.
Is there any literature that you're aware of that differentiates between diabetes 1 and 2?
Just, more people have diabetes too.
Of course.
And that can actually be managed through diet and exercise, where diabetes 1
cannot
is
usually
for a different reason. Right. It's your body just
so as a modifiable risk factor, it would be diabetes 2 by the nature of it being modifiable. Got it.
Although diabetes 1 does increase a risk of developing Alzheimer's disease.
As well.
Of course, that's treated with insulin because the pancreas it just doesn't produce insulin.
Right.
Where in diabetes 2, the pancreas does still produce insulin. It's just not doing its job by moving sugars out of your blood as it's supposed to.
Right.
So there are things that we can do to manage that by eating a proper diet and exercise is very important, and taking medications to lower your glucose. But that's a huge risk factor. And it is the reason people ask me all the time, well, why is it that Latinos are now 50% at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease? And it's because they have a higher propensity to develop cardiovascular disease
Or diabetes.
and
Yeah.
diabetes for some reason.
There's a correlation. Yeah.
And they have less access to health care to manage those conditions.
So interesting.
So that is the reason I saw the statistic and I thought, why is that the case? So I researched it, and that's the answer that I concluded after finding out why is it that a culture. But I think that also is probably true of African Americans. They're probably the next highest
Sure.
cultural ethnicity that develops Alzheimer's disease. But so anyway, you have all of these. I mean, it's probably too much information to really dig down into a lot of detail. But the point is you've got the modifiable risk factors, the ones you can do something about. And I mean, there are so many. Hearing loss is a huge risk factor for developing Alzheimer's disease. But if you're treating it with hearing aids, then you're going to just negate that. It's letting these conditions go unmanaged and untreated that's going to add to your risk. So the more of these risk factors that apply to any individual person that you either cannot change or that you're not managing will increase a person's risk. Now, does that mean, and it also runs in families like in mine,
Right.
But does that mean that I am definitely going to develop Alzheimer's disease?
No.
No. There's an exception to every single rule. But if there are ways to lower your risk, then it's probably something that most people want to consider, because why do you want to increase your risk or have a higher risk of developing this disease if there are things that you have control over? So that's the way that works. But I mean, you could do everything that increases your risk and you just might not be the one that develops Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Your first book, Not All Who Wander Need Be Lost, was written at the urging of a lot of people you worked with over the years. What was the request? What did people want to have in a written form?
I'll tell you the story of the inspiration, the impetus behind me actually sitting down and writing that book, because it's a great story. And I've been thinking about it for years because I've been working with families for decades by that time. I would hear the same pain from everybody, lack of resources, can't find information, nobody will tell us what to do. So I had my own consulting business at the time. And basically I worked with families, educating them about Alzheimer's and kind of the best practices and how to respond to the behaviors that we see commonly with the disease. And one of my clients referred me to this woman. She called me and she invited me over to her home. And she said, Lisa, I just really want to talk to somebody who knows about brain disease and hopefully can get some valuable information, some guidance from you. So it turns out that her father had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And her parents were now living in their granny flat on their property. Mm-hmm. And then her husband's mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, but lived in Oregon, and we're in California. So she was in her earlier stages, but she was in a different state. So they didn't really have the same lens on her that they did on this gal's father. He was right there at their home. And the diagnosis, I think, for both parents probably came about 2 years prior to her calling me over to her home. So anyway, long story short, they just started asking me questions and picked my brain for about the next 2.5 hours. And then she stops me and she says, Lisa, I'm just going to stop you right there for a minute because I really want to tell you that you have provided us with more helpful and useful and valuable information about the day-to-day realistic living with these diseases than anybody we've been able to speak to or Google or our doctors since the diagnosis 2 years ago.
Wow.
Well, then what she said after that was where I'm going with this story. She says, you really need to write a book. And then she says, it would be very selfish of you to not share what you know with families like mine. She said, I'm talking from experience. We're all desperate to know what you know. And it's so hard to find this information. Now, of course, that was almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It was more than 10 years ago because the book came out in 2015.
Right.
But I thought about it, and it was the way she said it to me, because I had been thinking about a book for a long time. I had heard very similar experiences from family members for years. But it was the way she said it to me that was kind of my aha moment. And I said to myself, she's right. I do need to share what I know because nobody else is doing it.
Yeah.
Things have changed a little bit in the last couple of years since COVID, but we're not nearly where we need to be with helping people understand this disease. So that was really the impetus that got me to actually sit down and start writing the stories and the explanations and the illustrations of all these behaviors that are a common part of the disease that my years of experience in working with families and the people who were living with Alzheimer's disease just weren't connecting the dots and putting two and two together. So I thought, okay, she got my attention. Yeah. I am going to write the book.
Okay, so that fantastic story and through line there. What brought you to write yet a second book, Truth Lies in Alzheimer's, Its Secret Faces? What was left out? What did you realize? Oh no, there's another book here.
Well, basically the objective of the first book was not to do an information overload situation and give people too much information where they just felt overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. It was really intended to provide core principles and fundamentals to help people first understand the disease and what it does to the people who live with it. I probably could write several books as there's a lot of information to pass on to people about how to respond to the behaviors and all the things that come up. So the second book, really, to answer your question, was to expand on the information that was provided in the first one. So
what's the main focus? Is it just an expansion, or was there one little sliver or avenue of dealing with the disease that you wanted to dive into?
Well, we added a chapter on the impact that COVID had on people living with Alzheimer's disease, which was pretty compelling.
Yeah.
And there's some definite changes and an expansion of information. So let's say we kind of took it to the next level of understanding. So kind of part deux of the book. But there's still so much more that I've also written a training program recently. I just finished it.
Oh, wow.
That
who's that directed towards?
the family members and the caregivers.
Okay. Oh, wow. On how to care for people who have Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so whether you're kind of a on the sidelines caregivers, like a lot of family members are, but they're going to visit their loved ones with Alzheimer's disease or dementia, like, maybe they're in a care facility.
Mm-hmm.
They're not actually the primary caregiver.
Mm-hmm.
But I used to run a support group at a memory care facility, and I listened to what these family members went through with having a loved one, even though they weren't the primary caregiver. And it's just as painful for them as it is being a caregiver because of the hallucinations and the delusions and the paranoia and the personality changes. And not a lot of the people who suffer from Alzheimer's disease at some point don't recognize their loved one, their family member,
Yeah.
or they do and then they don't. So all of these things create a lot of agitation and frustration and pain for the family members, even if they're not the primary caregivers. So I teach people how to effectively respond to all the behaviors and situations that arise that are actually caused by this disease. And the bottom line of that is so they can have a better and more enjoyable relationship with their loved one with less stress.
Yeah.
Because people find it very hurtful that they go to visit their mom and their mom has no clue who they are. They don't understand. She doesn't even know me.
Yeah.
It really hurts. So, I give the explanation of why that happens and how to respond to it.
Well, let's dive into that because I think that's a great example of understanding your approach and giving people a little bit of a taste of what's inside the book. I think it's a great example that we've seen definitely in the media, if not in person, right? If we have our own family members or friends who've gone through it, what is the right approach, right? What is the right response that you found helps kind of that bridge that hard part of the relationship to getting to a safer place there or a more stable?
So the answer to that question is evidence-based. It's based on years and years and decades of studies and trying one thing, see what works, what's not working. So the best approach that people believe is the way to address, let's say this is very common. And I mentioned that I've had 8 of my own family members suffer from Alzheimer's disease. And one of them, I'll tell you the story, was my mother-in-law. So she wasn't actually a blood relative. But she was over at our house. We were taking care of her for the day to give her primary caregiver a break. And we were having a normal conversation. She seemed to be very lucid and everything seemed really normal. And then out of nowhere, she pops up off the sofa and demands that I take her home because she claimed that her husband, Marty, was there at home waiting for her, and it was getting close to dinner, and he would be really upset with her if she wasn't there to fix him dinner. Well, the odd part of the conversation was that Marty had been deceased for close to 5 years by that time. So just in the turn of a dime, she went from our reality being the same to all of a sudden, bammo, she thinks her husband's waiting for her at home and she's got to race home to fix him dinner.
Yeah.
Now, my experience and what I've seen is our instinctive reaction to that would be to try to correct them.
Right.
We are wired to fix people, to fix situations, especially when it comes to our children or our loved ones. We want to fix things for them so they're not in pain.
Right.
In this particular situation, that is probably about the worst thing that we can do. So think of it this way. If I had said, Marianne, what are you talking about? Marty's been gone for close to 5 years. Don't you remember? Those are like
Right.
the taboo words. Don't you remember?
Mm-hmm.
No, they don't remember. It could have been a situation where I caused her to go into a complete panic, because if she believed in her reality, in her mind, that Marty was still alive and waiting for her at home, and then all of a sudden I come out and say he's dead,
Yeah.
she could have just like, what are you talking about? When did this happen? Nobody told me.
Right.
And just go into a total panic. And that's one of the risks you take, trying to reorient a person living with brain disease back into your reality. She believed 1,000% that Marty was alive and well and waiting for her at home. And we know there is absolutely nothing that anybody can do or say to change that belief in a person who's currently having
So do you
false
play into
hope.
their reality? Is that the right way to go?
That's exactly what you do. And some people have a problem with that because
But you
they
don't drive her
think,
home to non-existent Marty. You say maybe something like the approach is, oh, what are you going to make him for dinner? I mean, is there, because there's a certain line, right? If someone thinks they're still going to go skydiving and you're going to put themselves in danger, you don't want to do that either.
exactly.
Right.
And that was that would have been a good response. What are you thinking about giving him for dinner? But the way I handled it was she was standing up. She was in a panic. She was really nervous. She was like, come on, let's get in the car. I gotta go. Cause she was from the generation where she was, a homemaker.
Right.
And that was her job, was to
Right.
take care of her husband. And he calls and says, he's waiting for her, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, she's going to be really upset with me.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a big deal to her.
Yeah.
So I said, oh, Marianne, no, I just got off the phone with Marty, and he knows you're here. He knows we're having a really, really nice visit. And he wanted me to tell you that as soon as we're finished, like in the next 10 or 15 minutes, that I would bring you home. And he was perfectly fine with that. So you can just sit back down and relax. We'll visit for a few more minutes, and then I will take you home. And she goes, are you sure? Are you sure? Because I know how he gets when he's hungry and, blah, 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 blah,
right.
blah. And I said, I promise you that he knows you're here and that he's absolutely fine with it and is so happy you're having a nice visit with your son and daughter-in-law and grandkids and blah, blah, blah. So she sat back down on the sofa, was completely calm. I addressed her concern. I put it to rest. And by the time I was ready to take her home, she had completely moved on to something else and never even mentioned it again.
Right.
And what happened was, and this is the best analogy that I have been able to come up with to help people understand what happens and why these false beliefs occur. Would you like me to share that with you? I don't know if we have. Okay. So now, the first part of the brain that Alzheimer's disease attacks is our short-term memory.
Mm-hmm.
Our long-term memories stay intact for most people for the duration of the disease. Even a lot of times at the end, they are still pulling from their long-term memories.
Right.
So in the beginning stages of the disease, think of your short-term memory being hooked up to a switch that you can turn it on or off, on or off. But this switch goes on and off automatically.
Right.
Without notice.
Right.
So in the beginning stages of the disease, that switch has the short-term memory on most of the time, with a few exceptions where it gets flipped off, like
Moments
without
of
any
confusion,
notice.
moments of, that's where the memory loss comes.
You don't remember anything that's recent.
Yeah.
As a person progresses into the mid stage of the disease, that switch now is on half the time and off half the time. And then by the end of the disease, some people switch goes off permanently and they have no short-term memory left at all.
That's
So,
when you hear those stories of someone having a conversation and having to introduce themselves within the context of a 10 or 15-minute conversation, maybe 3 times, 4 times to the same person. Is that what you're talking about?
that's one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, repetitive stories and things like that. But that is why people, when their short-term memory switch flips off and it basically short circuits and it's not functioning and it can happen like this, they don't recognize their grown daughter because now they've gone back, they're pulling from their past memories. It's different for everybody what period of time they've gone back to. It's kind of like living your life on rewind.
Yeah.
So this happened to my mother-in-law a lot. When her short-term memory switch went off, she believed her husband was alive and waiting for him at home.
Right.
Other times she talked about being 12 years old and she hadn't gotten married yet. She was in junior high. She would look at my husband and call him Otto because she wasn't old enough to have a grown son at that time in her mind, because she was 12 years old in her mind.
So who's Otto?
Otto was her brother.
Oh, gotcha. Right.
So she knew him from somewhere. She recognized him. But because she was obviously in her mind not old enough to have been married and had a grown son,
Right.
she thought, okay, this is my
Yeah,
brother.
I've seen that firsthand too, where people think that their kids or their spouses and things like that. Yeah, for sure.
This is exactly why this happens. It's because that short-term memory switch got flipped off.
And the point in the timeline of their long-term memory they're living in connects closer to the age of whoever they're talking to, but they make a different connection. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
They know that they always know that they're connected to people. They recognize people, but they can't place them in the right timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So when this happened to my mother-in-law and she looked at my husband, he couldn't possibly be her adult son.
Right.
So in
He
her mind,
became the brother in her mind.
the
Right.
brother, and all she talked about was going and playing tennis and beating these 2 other kids at tennis that they routinely played with. Now, the thing is that makes it difficult, and this is where people really have to pay attention. You have to listen to the cues that the person with dementia is giving you about where they are on that timeline. So when she started calling my husband Otto, of course I knew, well, Otto's the brother.
Right.
And talking about the tennis tournaments and all about, that part of their lives, I knew where she was on her timeline.
It's like a little scavenger hunt. You have to you have to be
and
a detective.
Many people regress back to their childhood. So they're asking, where's my mommy? Why isn't my mommy here?
Mm-hmm.
So if you listen to the cues, or what they're talking about, you can place where they are in their timeline and then respond effectively to what they're talking about. So the switch going on and off is temporary, but frequent in the mid stages. And then, as I said, by the end stage of the disease, sometimes in a lot of people, it goes off permanently and they have no short-term memory left at all. So they are, in their reality, in their beliefs, they are living wherever they ended up on their timeline. And it's different for everybody.
Right.
Some are in the prime of their life as a housemaker and they're looking for their children, or some have reverted back to their childhood and are looking for their parents and their parents' home.
Mm-hmm.
Some are more like my mother-in-law, where she was now back at her adolescent period of life.
Yeah.
It's different for everybody, and because it's different for everybody, you have to follow their cues and then adapt your reality to theirs. But now keep in mind that switch can go back on like that, and they're back in the same reality as we are. And then all of a sudden, what they're telling you is completely different and now makes sense again. So then you have to switch back to the same reality that you're both sharing. So you really have to pay attention because, as I said, we can create serious catastrophic reactions for people if we're not careful how we respond to their beliefs at the time. Because, believing a spouse is still alive who hasn't been alive for years is actually very, very common.
Thank you so much for all of this amazing information. It's eye-opening to say the least. Your latest book can be found at truthliesalzheimers.com. Is that correct?
That's my website, yes, and it's also available on Amazon.
Okay, great.
Along with the other fine booksellers, yeah.
All right, wonderful. Lisa, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your time and sharing all this amazing knowledge, and keep doing what you're doing. I think it's so sad that there's not more information, and we need more people like you out there helping.
Thanks, John. Thanks again for having me. It was an absolute pleasure, and I really hope that this was really helpful and valuable to your listeners.
Yeah.
That
Selfishly, it was helpful to me. So, so even if nobody else got anything out of it, I'm happy. But I'm sure. I always say if I found it helpful, there's somebody out there who's going to feel the same way for sure.
Well, I have had a lot of people say, I've never heard any of this stuff before. So
yeah,
it is eye-opening. Yeah.
Thank you again. If you're interested in learning how to get the absolute most out of your romantic relationships, then you're in luck, because I have put together a free workshop or masterclass, if you will, about 3 secrets that people in happy relationships have discovered. You can view the workshop at mrspirituality.com/3secrets. Again, it's completely free. Just go there and watch it. It'll help you on your journey, give you some wisdom, some things to think about. The website again is mrspirituality.com/3secrets. That's mrspirituality.com/3, the word secrets. It's all yours. Enjoy.